Good morning,
Good
everyone.
morning.
Welcome to Guest Thursday on Daily Dose. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well too, thank you. We're really excited to have a guest with us today that we've been talking about. Actually, we talked about him a bunch last week because he wrote a post that super inspired us, and then we've been talking about him this week. Please join us in welcoming David Whitesock from Commonly Well, all the way from Potsdam, New York these days.
Well, hello. Great to join you this morning. And I've loved the little short shows that you do and the other conversations. This is fun to actually sit here with both of you.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you.
we're really excited to have you on because you have taken a really interesting approach based on your personal experience, I imagine. You can tell us that, but you've taken a really interesting approach to thinking about sobriety. So David, before we get into that, let's start with the question we ask everyone, which is just sort of what's your journey from there to here? And your there can start wherever you would like to start it.
Yeah, I guess my there is pretty close to where you are. I grew up in a military family. My dad was in the Air Force, so we were stationed at Grand Forks, and I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go. The one thing I knew growing up, though, was I never felt comfortable inside my own skin. I didn't know what that was about. I never really clicked with people around me. And so as life progressed and, my parents got divorced, got remarried, we moved to a tiny little town in North Dakota. I thought that maybe what I would do is go to North Dakota State and become an architect. But in the middle of all of that, I found alcohol. And alcohol solved a lot of those social problems. And what I didn't know at the time was it solved my anxiety and depression that was not diagnosed.
Yeah.
And from there, things just took off. Life just kind of was a 1,000-mile-per-hour train that was on fire that led to a number of DUIs, dropping out of college, eventually getting a phone call that would sort of kind of change my life from a high school friend who was also sort of socially awkward like me at the time. He was working in radio in Grand Forks. And he said, this was right after the 97 flood.
Oh, wow.
And there were people who just simply couldn't make it to the radio station because it was just outside of town.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, look, you live in Thompson. You could come to the radio station. And I was like, no, I don't like speaking in front of people. And no. And he said, look, if I can do it, you can do it. And it was like, okay, you're right. So my next question was, does it pay? Because I had a habit to fulfill, and which was getting expensive. And so that started a radio career for about a decade. But when you work in radio in a smallish town, it's tied to a culture of drinking. So I could hide in that culture with my disease and my illness for quite a long time until a second DUI, a third, and eventually a fourth driving the company vehicle where they had to actually fire me. And that was sort of the beginning of the final spiral. I'd eventually attempt suicide twice over the course of 18 months. In the middle of that, found myself on the cover of the technology section of the Sunday New York Times for podcasting in 2004.
Wow.
And so my life was all over the place. And then eventually I was passed out, barely breathing in my parents' basement. And my dad said, we can't have you here anymore. You're not going to kill yourself in front of us and your mom. So you've got 10 days, get out. By the end of the day, I had showered, and because I knew the internet, I found a open radio job in a little tiny town of Winter, South Dakota.
Wow.
And Friday, that was a Wednesday. Friday, I had an interview, so I drove. And they said, we'll hire you to be our sports director. And I was starting that job on Monday. And so that was a mess because 3 months later, I got another DUI, my fifth. And that was the moment where I ended up in a courtroom with a judge who said, I don't understand this. I don't know how somebody who looks like you, has all the things that you've had, like you, ends up in a place like this, between two Indian reservations in rural South Dakota. How does that happen? And so she said, we're going to fix this. And the only tool that she had, and this was 2006, was a new program in South Dakota, which was twice daily breathalyzers for anybody who had a second DUI or higher.
Okay.
So she said, if I can just keep you sober long enough, you'll figure it out.
Oh, that's interesting.
And because she said in court, and I've got the transcript, she said, look, if I put you in the prison in Sioux Falls, you're dead. Either figuratively dead, because you'll go there and the soul, your life will just get sucked out of you. You'll leave and you'll become nothing. You'll just be put out to the wolves in the world. Or she said, you'll go there and you'll last a week and you'll get killed. You'll actually get killed. And she's like, I don't want that on my conscience. And so she sentenced me to 5 years of supervised probation, put me in her jail for 180 days, said, if you screw up, you're going to go to prison for 2. I want you to go to an AA meeting every day for 5 years. And I want you to do these breathalyzers every day for 5 years.
Wow.
And so, in the middle of all that, I moved to a sober home in Sioux Falls, met some incredible people, but couldn't really get any work. So one guy I knew, Kevin Kirby, happened to know everybody. So he knew the general manager at a radio station. So that was some part-time work. But the only thing I really knew that I could potentially do was gamble and go back to college. So I wrote a letter to the judge and said, Judge Trandall, I could get back into the University of North Dakota. I talked to the registrar. My 1.9 GPA doesn't qualify me, but they'll make an exception. And she wrote back a couple of days later and said, that's wonderful news, but no, if you want to go back to college, you're going to pick a school here in the state of South Dakota.
Wow.
And so here's the bit that works well for folks in the Dakotas. I grew up watching North Dakota hockey, right? As a kid, just watching North Dakota hockey. I went to the potato game, the Potato Bowl. It was always UND versus South Dakota. I did not like the Jackrabbits. I did not like the Yotes. There was no way I was going to South Dakota State or USD. But I was told that USD had a journalism school that was worthy and I should go there. And so I reluctantly did.
Yep.
But skip ahead. I met a professor in an elective class who was a public defender. She taught constitutional law. She heard my story and said, you've got to become a lawyer. Don't waste your life going back into radio. And again, another little pivot point, somebody kind of hitting nudge and opening up a world of saying, I don't think I can be a lawyer. I'm a convicted felon. And she says, forget about the felony thing, but have you met a bunch of lawyers? They're not all that bright. To all my members of the bar in South Dakota, sorry. He said, look, you need to be in the courtroom. You need to be the one advocating for people because you woke up on those concrete floors. You know what that's like. And you know what it's like to stand in a courtroom wearing orange. So she'd go back to the courtroom every summer for 2 summers while I was a student, and she'd testify. And finally, the judge modified my sentence. So when I graduated with a history degree in 2009, my sentence ended. And then I was able to get into a master's program. I had to fight through a summer program to get into law school at USD, did that. So skip ahead, I got a law degree, a master's degree, and a history degree from the University of South Dakota, which I didn't really want, but go Yotes. And so I mean, that's a long story, but just kind of an arc of alcohol and addiction were really prominent. It took me to some really dark places, but with some motivating resets as people came into my life, sort of opening up vision and saying, you can do this, I'll help you. That was able to transpire into a lot of pretty fascinating things.
That's interesting.
God, it's incredible, David.
So
Wow.
I got a question for you, because I know through going to AA, there's that every now and then it gets brought up in conversation where people resent that they have to be there, or they resent that they have to take a breathalyzer for a certain amount of time. Did that resentment ever come up on you, or were you just grateful to be in that program and
Not in a federal
not lying
prison.
on a concrete floor
Yeah.
somewhere?
Yeah, gratitude showed up pretty quick. I think that I had resentment, sure, right? I mean, there are times that you're standing in line with 100 other people at 6:30 in the morning, and it's cold and snowing or raining, and you look around and go, why am I here?
Mm.
Who are these people? That happens all the time. And you could look across the street and go, there's a bar, and that's easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of resent some of that. But I think at the end of the day, what I found was there were just the right people. If I chose correctly, right? If I had my radar on and I pushed away the negative people and I brought in the people who I thought were positive, go to a meeting was not about the meeting. It wasn't about hearing all the really terrible war stories, which were just on repeat. It was just Groundhog's Day. Sorry, 12-step folks, but a lot of times it's just Groundhog's Day. I was usually there sometimes to wait to talk to somebody specific.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get a chance to see that person because they live a different life than I do, but I want to see that person.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty intentional.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I never really got a really strong resentment. I kind of resented sometimes, the way you had to queue up for dinner and lunch, and then you had to wait for certain other people to go through first, or then they locked it down for other people in the facility to go through and get their lunch and then go into another area. And sometimes I'd stand there going, why am I here? And then I always used to remind myself, yeah, because you're an alcoholic and you're here to get help. So take your head out of your biscuits and keep going forward.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I think two interesting things happened along the way. One was once I got back into school, I took a global health class. So it was kind of this liberal arts, everybody's got to do it kind of thing. And the professor in that class, we all had to do a volunteer project. And he kind of, I think he's a lot like you, Dr. Murray. He very inquisitive about people,
Mm-hmm.
particularly. And he's like, you don't fit. You're a non-traditional. You're sitting in the front row. What are you doing? And I told him, and he said, you know what? That would be interesting. He said, you should look into the twice daily breathalyzer. There's some interesting behavioral stuff there about global health, about forcing people to do something to change their behavior. Go look into that. There's got to be something there. So I did. And I picked up the phone and I called the Attorney General at the time, Larry Long. He didn't respond. He had invented the program. And so I wrote a paper. I looked at the research and I wrote a paper and I said, effectively what twice daily breathalyzers does is it creates a crutch effect. And that crutch effect is if I'm always walking with crutches, I never actually allow my legs to work up the strength to do the thing. So my sobriety was reliant upon those two breathalyzers.
Yeah.
That creates resentment. And so I wrote this paper and then I sent it to his office and he sent it back like any good lawyer would, with a whole bunch of red ink on it and other arguments that he would make. And then when I got to law school, we had a face-to-face and we started having a conversation about that. And he realized that the 947 days that I was doing twice daily breathalyzers was far too long, that 120 to 180 days is maybe max. And so I had a chance to sort of work on those programs around the country with him and have that conversation. We have to put people in a position to think about these things. But the other side of that coin is, I think to your point, Dr. Mary, is discipline.
Yes.
How do we put discipline and routine in our life? And if it means standing in line to get our chow in the morning, to sort of recalibrate us as human beings, do it.
Yeah,
Do it.
it is a small price to pay if you can keep focus enough to remind yourself of that. That's how I kept going. It is a little bit of discipline too.
Well, the thing that I think so often in all of these conversations, and I talk about this all the time, but is just how alcoholism, addiction, sobriety, the treatment, the programs are really just like microcosms of the rest of the world. We all do better with a little discipline. I mean, when you see an out of control toddler at the grocery store, it's either because the toddler is tired, the toddler is hungry, or the toddler doesn't understand the rules of behavior yet. And so they're out of control. They don't want to be out of control. Nobody wants to be an alcoholic or an addict or feel like they can't manage themselves. But something has come along and tripped that up. And we all do better when we sort of know the parameters and understand how to operate inside them. Or if we choose to break them, then we know that we're choosing to break the parameter for reasons that we've selected.
Yeah. Anybody who asks me for help, I kind of give them a list of about 4 or 5 things. One of them always is to blow up whatever they think their routine is, and to
Yeah.
rewrite a routine,
Yep.
and to get the routine so boring that after 7 days or 30 days that they want to fight me.
Wow.
Because usually what happens by that time is they realize they forgot about drinking.
Yeah.
And they've started thinking about everything else around that routine that they're trying to keep in line to make sure the routine doesn't end.
Wow.
And it's sort of the mental gymnastics. It's using a little bit of jujitsu of psychology to get people to think about something else. If I stub my toe on something, maybe I'll throw my fist into the wall because that'll hurt more.
Mhm.
Right? And now I'm not thinking about my toe. We can do that creatively in a lot of different ways.
Huh? Sure.
Sometimes it takes an outsider to go, well, let's create a different anvil over your head to forget about the drinking.
That's really amazing. So that sort of leads into this work that you have created, this Recovery Capital Index, which is so fascinating.
I think it's
so
amazing.
I want you to talk about it because
one
you've really
thing-
looked into it.
One thing that going backpedaling for a sec, I like the way you state it right up front that it's a scientifically validated survey.
That would resonate with
Because
the scientists.
I see that as, oh, right, but I know why that's there too. I bet you it's because you got a lot of negative feedback from people
I can't
who
tell
are
you.
academics that said this is not scientifically valid when you go on to prove to them that it actually is. I bet you that happened.
I'd have a retirement home in northern Denmark by now for every dollar of a doctor telling me I'm not going to use this until it's gone through the rigors of science.
Yeah.
And what I love about this, and I knew that as soon as I saw that, I thought, yep, you had, and I bet you had to prove it, which means it definitely is. I was talking to our son, and he was worried about, because he'd looked into addiction, and he was, he said, well, why do you go to AA? Why aren't you on some kind of prescribed medication to reduce the cravings for alcohol? And I'd love to know your opinion on this before we get into this. I think that is just typical wanting to use a drug to fix things. And what's the point of giving an addict something that they'll get hooked on thinking they need? Oh, I have to take my drug to stop me thinking about drinking. And in my mind, that kind of becomes an addiction. That's a transference of addiction.
Yeah. Bruce Lee once said the medicine for my suffering is within me.
Yeah.
Yes.
We don't need pharmaceuticals. Addiction is purely a human condition. Maybe there's chemical imbalances when it gets super dependent and super neurological that we can reverse through some medicines, which I think is necessary.
Yeah.
But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's what's the pain? What's the trauma? What's the things that are existent there for me to need to crave some other thing, alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, whatever, that I need to build up this pseudo pleasure to overcome something. I don't know. I wake up and what do I want? I want coffee. I want coffee because I am kind of dependent on it. I have it every day. If I don't have it, I get a headache.
Yeah.
So, everybody drink our coffee. Could I take something to get me to not drink coffee anymore? Sure, I could. There's all kinds of neural blockers.
Yeah.
But I could just create a new routine to not have me have it. And ultimately over time,
Yeah.
I'll not need it. But I also get pleasure in the process of making an espresso. It's a meditation too.
It's also an activity. I mean, there's been all those loads of studies, and you talk about it in this about you can't just stop someone drinking and then sit them in a room and expect them to be perfectly happy. You have to give them something to do.
Well, it's your schedule disruption.
Yeah, the schedule thing as well. I mean, that all comes down to it. Like, they even did studies on mice where they got mice addicted to things, got them off things, and then just put them in a box. And those mice weren't happy. But you even put a simple wheel in there, or put them somewhere else so they could run around for a few minutes, and they were much happier.
The rat park studies. My running mantra on this issue is we'll solve addiction when we don't solve for addiction. All of the solutions are it's a nail. I've got a hammer. I want you to quit drinking. Go to AA. Okay. That's kind of the thing.
Yep.
No. How do we build the hamster wheels inside of communities so that nobody needs or wants to use those things in the first place? Whether you have the predisposition to, because there is a genetic element and there is an environment element, but I do believe the environmental elements trump the genetics. Look at diabetics, for instance. You can reverse diabetes. People are doing it all the time. And why is it? It's food, connection, exercise, sleep. Those are the 4 primary things. That applies to all areas of human life. Big proponent of blue zones and how we think about where are the places on Earth where people live the longest and the healthiest.
Yep.
We reject that notion in the United States because I want my big truck. I want my 16-ounce beer. I want my big wide open field and my giant house. And I want all of these things I want.
Yep. And then when it doesn't work, I want a quick fix, not a slow, sustainable fix.
Which is still the same problem because you want the instant gratification.
Because that's a throwaway society, and we've mentioned this before. We got into the habit of throwing people away as well.
We do. Yeah, look at how many of us, got tossed away into treatment facilities or insane asylums or jails.
Yeah,
we do it all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, what I like about this is you have proved a point my fantastic counselor Joanne Spearing came up with. She said to me once, any idiot can be sober. You just don't drink. The hard bit is wanting to stay sober and have a life.
Yeah, Maya Salovitz wrote a book called The Unbroken Brain. I don't agree with a lot of what she's written in there, but one thing she says is that addiction primarily is a learning problem. From very early on, we're not taught properly how to cope. Yeah. And so ultimately, if I don't want to drink, why do I drink? I drink because I hate the way I feel. There's an emotion that's coming up that if I just sit down with a bottle of Jack Daniels, I will smash that feeling.
Yeah.
I'll get a whole bunch of other feelings, but I don't care about those. So, how do we help people? How do we teach people from day one? When you feel X, here's your response. We need more of that. I'd like to see that in kindergarten. I'd like to see that with moms and dads, as opposed to a lot of the other things that we try to do.
Well, and wouldn't it be interesting? So we talk about this a lot because it makes me insane. This sort of mommy wine culture, the sweatshirts, the tea towels, just the garbage. It's so embarrassing to me as a middle-aged, middle-class woman that is what people now think women are doing, and that so many of them are. But what if that was on the sweatshirt instead of, well, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, or I only have one glass of wine and the glass is the size of the bottle, all that crap. What if we actually talked about, you're probably pretty bored with your life, because I can tell you as a stay-at-home mom, as much as I adored my son, I was not getting intellectually fed by a 2-year-old. It's just not possible. So you have to figure out, what are the trade-offs? Where am I finding that intellectual stimulation? Whatever. It's not from wine. It's not from wine.
Yeah, that's a cultural thing, because if you spent any time in Italy or France, wine is a central pillar.
Yeah.
It's more of a magnet that brings people together. The way those cultures engage around wine is different than the US. We engage around a keg of beer, and our goal is to finish the keg.
Yeah.
Right.
To what end?
Yeah, a lot of Italian families actually have massive bottles of alcohol, but they have it for a specific occasion, and you don't touch it.
Mm.
And they actually have, they have lower instances of alcoholism.
Well, of course.
I mean, it's not saying they don't have alcoholism.
Sure.
But it's one more thing I'd love to ask you about this whole recovery capital thing you did about social, personal, and cultural aspects of it. That goes back to the rat study thing, but I'm interested. I like the fact that you have beliefs in spirituality in there and sense of purpose. Well, I asked you this, and I don't mean to insult any belief you have, but one of the huge things I seem to talk mostly to people with, I once said that in an AA meeting, it was like an off-the-cuff comment, is that I think we make a mistake every time someone says, have some faith, that we're talking about a religion. And loads of people say, oh my God, that's brilliant. I thought, well, that wasn't even me. I just said, I wish I said that, but I'm just quoting somebody else. But I don't think that's something I think a lot of people don't talk about. We always fall back on it has to be a hardcore religion. And I know some Native Americans that have said to me, thank you for saying that, because, how can I as a Native American believe in a Christian God? I'm not a Christian.
Or Muslims
Or
or
Muslim,
Jews or,
yeah.
It's a pretty bold assumption that we all make generally in America, that, well, you're here, obviously you're a standard Christian. In fact, you're probably a Lutheran. If you're from the Midwest, we just
Yes.
assume you're a Lutheran.
So drink your bad coffee and shut up.
Yeah.
Yes. Have your lefse, church on Friday night with the fish fry.
Yeah.
You also mentioned sense of community values. I think that's brilliant, because that's what does make you an all-rounded person. I mean, this could be something, again, this indicators of sustainable recovery. I think we should all do it, even non-alcoholics too, because it's actually what, if you read through this, it's actually what human beings are supposed to be.
Well, I'm looking at it and it feels like, what if and maybe you're doing all this. I'm sorry, David, I don't know enough about what you do, but why wouldn't we be applying this to nursing homes? The instance of tremendous loneliness, which leads to horrific decline in our elderly, because we just shuffle them off. A nursing home, in some cases, is not unlike a jail. And so why aren't we doing that for them? Or why aren't we doing it for new American moms whose husbands are working 2 or 3 jobs, and they're home with these 6 or 7 children in these tiny apartments, don't speak the language, have no access to culture.
Yeah.
The sustainable recovery is, to your point, not at all just for addicts. We all need to have sustainable recovery.
Yeah. On the faith bit, quickly, I always say to people, if you drive or you get in a car with somebody, you're in a 2,000-pound hunk of metal, and there's hundreds of other people on the road. If you don't have faith when you drop on the road that you're not going to die of these other people not running into you, you're missing something in life.
Well, and you say that as a recovered bike accident. I mean, that blog post was unbelievable. So
right. Get hit by a drunk driver on a bike. That'll change your perception a little bit.
On your way to a breathalyzer test.
Yeah. Well, that's the weird world. You want to think about, is there something higher or greater? Maybe. So as organizations, as I'm talking to organizations, and we're talking about putting the RCI into their treatment facility or something, invariably the people that I'm visiting with, the decision makers, are not in recovery themselves. Mm-hmm. And I will send them the survey and ask them to do it so they can get an idea. The ones that really care, the ones that I know are in, will call me up and say, I haven't thought about my life like that in a long time. That tells me two things. One, society is completely missing the mark, that we're too on top of the surface of the world around us. And then two, it says they're now finally finding empathy, like real, true empathy for the people that they serve. And that's not a judgment. I don't mean that to say it in a bad way, but you have to get into that moment of, as from the 12 steps, I'm going to do an inventory, right? We designed this instrument essentially to be a twist on doing an inventory. I do this every 30 days. I've got to do it later today. I carve out 30 minutes. It's a meditation for me. It's a meaningful, purposeful moment. I haven't had a drink in 15 years. But I know that during COVID, my recovery capital index went from a 77 to a 54.
Wow.
Why? If I show that to somebody and say, here's a person unidentified, their RCI dropped 23 points. What happened on this drop? 100% will say he relapsed.
Huh.
And I'll go, well, that was me. I didn't. My job changed. I started a business and I moved halfway across the country in the middle of a pandemic.
Yep.
Having focus on that, you can see the dip and you can go, okay, I'm resilient enough now because I think about these things all the time. I know how to spring back from that. Well, it sprung back. It took 3 months, but my score is back up in the 70s. It's not perfect, but it's a way to inventory every 30 days and think about that. And so not everybody wants to live in a quantified self world, and that's fine. But I think for those, and you said it perfect, Dana, you want to have a little bit of an intellectual connection in your world.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can build that for ourselves. Other times we can go to a lecture. I love living in college towns, not during COVID, but I love living in college towns because you can go to a lecture. You can see somebody like Dr. Mary stand up on stage and talk about, biosciences or something that they've spent their whole life working on, and just take a sit back and go, this is their pentultimate. This is what they're doing. I don't know what he's talking about. I don't get any of it.
Yes, that is very true.
I don't understand any of it, but that's his purpose. That's why he's there.
Yep.
Trying to figure out the why of the world. Okay, I'm behind that. I don't know what he's saying, but I'm behind that. And I'll show up again.
I'll keep that in mind next time I do one of those talks. I'll pay more attention to the people at the front who are politely smiling at me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we tend to sometimes think as speakers that everybody in the room wants us to fail. It's never true. Maybe there's one. Maybe there's one.
Right. There's always the disgruntled guest, but you're right. People do want you to succeed.
Yeah, everybody wants you to make it through it, and it's nerve-wracking. But if there's any moment that anybody can stand up and just share what they're passionate about, I think they should find an opportunity to do it. I love what you're doing here because it's letting others kind of do the same thing in a window. And I know we've kind of gone over our time. But
no, that's fine.
No, that's fine.
I have one more quick question for you, David. How is this only for organizations? Can people engage on this in an individual way with you? And maybe that's really clear on your site, and I just haven't dug deep enough.
Right now, we're licensing it out to organizations. So treatment providers, hospitals, behavioral health clinics, counselors. What I'm learning more and more is that there are people that would like to just do this on their own. And so I'm visiting with, some scientists, some behavioral scientists, and some software engineers to try to figure that out. Mm-hmm. Getting into the consumer market to do something like this, there's a million apps out there. I want to be a little bit more intentional if I choose to do that. And I just, so your feedback to say you would be interested, sure. that gives me.
It feels like the minute you said that when you do it, it's a meditative practice for you, takes it from a place of judgment or feeling like a grown-up ACT to an opportunity to just slow down and reflect. I'm just working on a blog post this morning all about this. I'm like a honeybee. I'm at every freaking flower I can find. Sip, 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 sip. And it's exhausting. But what if I could look at one flower and say, I'm just going to sit with this flower for a little bit of time and see what I can take from it?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you sit down with that one flower, especially with the Recovery Capital Index, it's basically 68 well, it's 22 flowers, right? There are 22 indicators, but they tend to be a cross section of you, the one flower.
Mhm.
And they're all the little petals. I'm riffing on your analogy.
I love that.
And you don't want to pull away any of those one petals, right? You want them to all stay intact. And so how do you do that? You got to figure out what the vein is in each of those that lead to your core. William Moyers gives a great talk when he talks about his own journey from Hazel and Betty Ford. He says, your core is the whole, as people with addiction, what we actually suffer from is a hole in our soul. Now he means that with a small s.
Yep.
Well, everything that emanates out from that are all of these things like, what's our employment? Who are our friends? What's my purpose? Do I have a sense of connection to my community? Do I work at a university? Am I in arts or whatever it is? Does that connect for me? And if you ask those questions, and it's not like you need to have the greatest answer, but sometimes just being positioned with the question alone by yourself. I think, as Dr. Mary and I know, sometimes just sitting there with that in a moment of uncertainty and not knowing, that becomes the trigger. That becomes the new thing we crave.
Yeah.
And not people like us, we like to say, oh, we're special because we were in recovery and nobody's ever experienced this before. Talk to a cancer survivor. They know we're not special. Recovery isn't special. It's just one other life transforming experience. Some people are lucky to have a moment of like transcending event in their life. Some people are lucky to have that. My hope is that we could strip addiction being one of those experiences. Because I don't know about you, Dr. Mary, the whole thing was just hellish. And I honestly wish I never had to go through it. I really honestly wish, because it as page 82 of the big book, the alcoholic is like a tornado roaring through the lives of others.
Yeah.
I read that. It changed my life while I was in treatment, but then I went back to it and I wrote bullshit. Sorry.
You can say what you want. It's a grown-up show.
It's a grown-up show. We're doing grown-up ACTs, apparently.
Yeah. I mean, it's just BS, right? It's just, at the end of the day, it's BS. It's trying to create salvation where we don't necessarily need to have it.
There is something there. I've thought about that. I thought you're trying to lessen someone's guilt. You're trying to make them feel a little better about themselves. But if you keep going back to that, you miss the point of time to move on and be grateful, or try to be happy with what you've got now. It's another thing that like, don't dwell too much on the past.
That's right. And I did want to mention one other thing, Dana, because you mentioned it, the loneliness issue.
Yeah.
So one of the questions in the RCI comes from another World Health questionnaire. So when you read any story or study about loneliness and isolation, it comes from a question that's asked, if you were in trouble or experiencing something bad in your life, do you believe that there would be somebody out there who would know about that and could help you? Because if you're sitting there alone and you're not having interactions with people, and people will notice when something is off. Mm-hmm. So, in Palm Beach County, where we're using the RCI, hundreds of folks who took it during the course of 2020, 83% said that they didn't believe they had somebody or were uncertain that somebody would know that they were in trouble.
Wow.
83%. That is a crisis among crises.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so what the county decides to do with that and what the policymakers and the people with power decide to do with that, I don't know, but they have the data. They can't ignore it.
Wow.
And so getting in places like that and understanding, are the people that I care about struggling? That's the core.
Yeah.
That's the core. Will I pick up the phone because I saw that she or he was just a little bit different today? It's not their fault. It's my fault for not picking up the phone.
David, this has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, for sharing this work and your own journey. I mean, I know you talk about it a lot, but our audience hasn't heard you talk about it. So we really appreciate it.
It was fascinating too.
Yeah, it's our first science conversation. This was as sciencey as we've gotten. I kind of try to avoid the science whenever possible. So it's nice for Dr. Mary to have another person who cares.
Addiction is biopsychosocial spiritual.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So for everybody, the link to David's website is in the description of the conversation. And wow, we were going to just continue to keep watch for the work that you're doing, because I can't wait for you to figure out how I can take this thing. I'm very nervous that I'm going to get like a 42%, which will spiral me, but I'll try to work through it.
Well, I now have both of your email addresses. So when we're done here, I'm sending it to both of you. You'll take it and we'll get you your scores and responses. And if you want to keep taking it every 30 days, we'll make sure you keep doing it.
Oh my gosh, I cannot wait. That's incredible. Thank you so much, David.
It's fantastic to meet you.
Wow.
And talk
Yeah, no, this was really wonderful and such a pleasure. And keep doing what you're doing because it's unique and it's very helpful.
Oh,
Thank you. Thank you. Everybody else, we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.